Hey, tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most seductive and deadly substances. A plant so beautiful it was named after the gorgeous women of Renaissance Italy, yet so poisonous it could kill a king with just a few drops. You might think you know the story of Belladonna, but trust me, the truth is far darker and more fascinating than you can imagine. If you're enjoying this journey through history's shadows, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our community connect across time zones. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, turn on that fan for some white noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. We're exploring Belladonna, the beautiful killer that seduced empires and destroyed kingdoms. Congratulations! You've just been transported to ancient Rome around 50 AD, and you're about to witness something that would change the course of history. The air is thick with incense and conspiracy. You're standing in the shadows of a villa belonging to one of the most powerful women in the empire, Agrippina the Younger, and she's preparing to commit the perfect murder. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a simple plant became the weapon of choice for assassins, poisoners and murderers throughout history, we need to go back even further. We need to understand what belladonna actually is and why it captured human imagination for thousands of years. The plant itself doesn't look particularly threatening. Atropa belladonna, its scientific name, grows wild across Europe, North Africa and Western Asia. It's a perennial shrub that can reach about 5 feet tall, with dull green leaves and flowers that hang like little bells, shifting from a greenish yellow to a deep purple as they mature. The berries are what really catch your eye though. Shiny black, about the size of a cherry, glistening with a juice so dark it looks like liquid night. Those berries taste sweet. That's the first trap. Children throughout history have been drawn to them, thinking they'd found a wild treat. Just 2 or 3 berries can kill a child. 10 to 20 can kill an adult. The plant doesn't advertise its danger. It doesn't smell bad or taste bitter enough to warn you away. Nature designed the perfect killer, beautiful enough to attract, sweet enough to consume, deadly enough to guarantee you'd never make that mistake twice. The name belladonna translates to beautiful lady in Italian, but that name didn't come from the plant's appearance. It came from what Renaissance women did with it. They would squeeze the juice from the berries into their eyes, enduring the burning sensation because it did something remarkable. It dilated their pupils, making their eyes appear larger, darker, more mysterious and seductive. Beauty has always demanded sacrifice, but this particular beauty trend could lead to blindness, and some women paid that price willingly. But the use of belladonna goes back much further than Renaissance vanity. The ancient world knew this plant intimately, feared it, worshipped it, and weaponized it with devastating efficiency. Let's go back to that Roman villa with Agrippina. The year is 54 AD, and she has a problem. Her husband, Emperor Claudius, is becoming inconvenient. She's already maneuvered her son Nero into position as Claudius's heir, but Claudius is starting to favor his own biological son Britannicus. Agrippina needs Claudius dead, and she needs it to look natural. Enter Locusta, history's first celebrity poisoner. Locusta was a professional. She understood poisons the way a master chef understands spices. She knew that belladonna, when prepared correctly, could be made to work slowly or quickly depending on the dose. She knew how to mask its effects to look like natural illness, and she knew that in the right hands, it was undetectable by the crude forensic methods of ancient Rome. The historical accounts vary on exactly how Agrippina did it. Some say Locusta poisoned a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite food. The mushroom's earthy flavor would mask any slight bitterness from the belladonna. Others say it was administered by the emperor's food taster, who had been bribed or threatened into compliance. What we know for certain is that Claudius fell ill after dinner, suffered through the night with symptoms that looked like food poisoning, violent vomiting, confusion, difficulty breathing, and died the next morning. Nero became emperor at age 16. Agrippina had succeeded. But here's where the story gets even darker. A year later, young Britannicus, still a threat to Nero's power, died suddenly during a feast. Same symptoms, same invisible killer. Locusta had struck again, this time on Nero's orders. This is what made belladonna so terrifying throughout ancient and medieval history. It was the weapon of choice for political assassination, because it mimicked natural death. The symptoms, seizures, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, could all be explained away as illness or weak constitution. In an era before toxicology, before anyone understood alkaloids or chemical compounds, belladonna was the perfect crime. But to really understand this plant's journey from ancient medicine to deadly weapon, we need to go back even further, to the very origins of human civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests humans have known about belladonna for at least 4,000 years. Ancient Sumerian texts reference a plant matching its description, calling it the plant of the underworld. The ancient Egyptians included it in their extensive pharmacological texts, using it in carefully measured doses for pain relief and to treat muscle spasms. They understood, as all ancient physicians did, that the difference between medicine and poison was simply a matter of dosage. The ancient Greeks called it strychnos manikos, the madness plant, because they recognized its effects on the mind. In small doses it could ease pain and help with sleep. In larger doses it caused vivid hallucinations, violent behavior, and a complete disconnect from reality. Greek physicians like Dioscorides documented its uses and its dangers in medical texts that would influence medicine for the next 1500 years. But the Greeks used it for more than medicine. The priestesses at some of the more obscure temples used belladonna to induce prophetic visions. They would consume carefully measured amounts, then enter states of delirium where they claimed to see the future and communicate with the gods. Whether they were truly seeing divine visions or simply experiencing the hallucinogenic effects of tropane alkaloids, we'll never know. But their prophecies shaped decisions that affected entire city-states. The Romans inherited this knowledge and expanded on it. Roman physicians used belladonna to perform early forms of anesthesia during surgery. They would create preparations called soporifics, sleep inducers that contained belladonna mixed with opium, hemlock, and other sedating plants. Soldiers wounded in battle would be given these mixtures before amputations or other brutal procedures. Many died from the cure rather than the wound, but some survived operations that would have been impossible to endure conscious. Roman women also discovered belladonna's cosmetic uses long before the Renaissance. They would create eye drops from the diluted juice, using it to enhance their appearance for important social occasions. The fashion spread throughout the empire, from Britain to Egypt, and with it came a steady stream of accidental poisonings and permanent eye damage. But it was as a poison that belladonna truly flourished in the Roman world. The empire was built on bloodshed, and maintaining power required eliminating rivals, inconvenient family members, and political threats. Poison was considered a more civilized form of murder than the knife or the sword, and belladonna was the poison of choice for the sophisticated assassin. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus and one of the most powerful women in Roman history, was rumored to maintain a poison garden at her villa. Historical accounts claim she cultivated belladonna, hemlock, and other deadly plants, studying their effects and keeping detailed records. Whether she actually used these poisons to eliminate Augustus's other heirs, paving the way for her son Tiberius to become emperor, remains a subject of historical debate. But the rumors persisted throughout her life and after her death, which tells you something about how common such practices were believed to be. The Roman historian Tacitus documented dozens of suspected poisonings among the imperial family and the senatorial class. Most couldn't be proven, but the symptoms he described, sudden illness, convulsions, respiratory failure, delirium, match perfectly with belladonna poisoning. The plant had become so associated with political murder that simply growing it in your garden could raise suspicions of treasonous intent. As the Roman Empire declined and fractured, the knowledge of belladonna spread across Europe, carried by physicians, herbalists, and those with darker intentions. The plant grew wild across the continent, and as centralized Roman authority collapsed, local healers and wise women preserved the ancient knowledge of its uses and dangers. This brings us to one of the darkest chapters in belladonna's history, the witch trials. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft across Europe and colonial America. The accusations varied, but many centered on the alleged use of flying ointments, magical preparations that supposedly allowed witches to fly to their Sabbaths and commune with the devil. Here's the thing, those flying ointments were real. They didn't actually let anyone fly, but they did contain belladonna, along with other psychoactive plants like henbane and mandrake. These ointments were applied to the skin, often to mucous membranes where absorption was most efficient, and they caused powerful hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and sensations of flying or floating. Women who practiced traditional herbal medicine, midwives, and healers who maintained the old knowledge used these preparations for pain relief, to induce sleep, or to help with various medical conditions. But the hallucinogenic side effects led to accusations of devil worship and black magic. Under torture, many confessed to flying on broomsticks, attending witch gatherings, and consorting with demons. They weren't lying about the experiences. The belladonna had made them genuinely believe these things had happened. The irony is that belladonna likely contributed to the witch hunt hysteria in another way. Some historians believe that accidental belladonna poisoning from contaminated grain or other food sources may have caused some of the bizarre behavior that sparked witch accusations in certain communities. Mass hallucinations, convulsions, and erratic behavior, all symptoms of belladonna toxicity, would have seemed like demonic possession to superstitious villagers. The witch trials scattered the traditional knowledge of herbalism and drove it underground. Women who understood plants and their properties became suspicious figures, their healing knowledge reframed as dark magic. But the knowledge survived, passed down in whispers, hidden in coded recipes, preserved by those brave or desperate enough to maintain the old ways. Meanwhile, in the royal courts and noble houses of Europe, belladonna continued its work as the silent killer. Renaissance Italy, that flowering of art, culture and humanism, was also the golden age of poisoning. The wealthy and powerful families of Italian city-states, the Medicis in Florence, the Borgias in Rome, the Sforzes in Milan, engaged in intricate power struggles where assassination was just another political tool, and belladonna was everywhere. The Borgias in particular became synonymous with poison. Pope Alexander VI and his children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, were rumoured to have perfected a poison called La Cantarella. The exact recipe was a closely guarded secret, but historical accounts suggest it contained belladonna as a primary ingredient, possibly mixed with arsenic and other toxins to create a more reliably lethal mixture. Cesare Borgia, the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, allegedly used poison to eliminate rivals and consolidate power throughout central Italy. Dinner invitations from the Borgias became something to fear. Cardinals and nobles would make excuses to avoid dining at the Borgia palace, knowing that many who accepted such invitations never left alive. The stories about Lucrezia Borgia, Pope Alexander's daughter, claim she wore a hollow ring filled with poison that she could slip into a guest's wine with a simple gesture. Whether these specific stories are true or simply the propaganda of the Borgia's enemies, we'll never know for certain. But we do know that the Borgia era saw an unprecedented number of sudden, mysterious deaths among the Italian nobility, and belladonna was implicated in many of them. The fashion spread beyond Italy. Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France, brought Italian sophistication to the French court, including, some claim, Italian methods of dealing with enemies. She was rumoured to maintain a cabinet of poisons and to have tested various toxins on sick prisoners and servants to study their effects and refine her techniques. One of the most notorious stories about Catherine involves her alleged use of poisoned gloves. The story goes that she sent a beautiful pair of perfumed gloves to Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre and a political rival. Jeanne wore the gloves and fell ill shortly after, dying within days. The gloves were supposedly treated with belladonna mixed with other toxins, allowing the poison to be absorbed through the skin. Modern historians debate the truth of these poisoning stories. Some argue they're exaggerations or fabrications by political enemies. But the sheer number of such accounts, combined with what we know about the availability of belladonna and the political climate of Renaissance Europe, suggests that at least some of these poisonings actually occurred. The medical profession of the Renaissance had a complicated relationship with belladonna. On one hand, physicians recognized its legitimate medical applications. It was used to treat asthma, as the alkaloids in belladonna cause the airways to dilate. It was used for digestive issues, as it slows gut motility. It was used as a painkiller and sedative. On the other hand, the line between therapeutic dose and lethal dose was terrifyingly thin. A physician had to be extraordinarily skilled and careful to use belladonna safely. Many weren't. Medical poisoning, whether accidental or intentional, was common enough that patients often feared their doctors almost as much as their diseases. The famous physician Paracelsus, who revolutionized Renaissance medicine with his emphasis on careful dosing and chemical preparation of medicines, wrote extensively about belladonna. He understood that properly prepared and measured, it could be a valuable medicine. He also understood that in the wrong hands it was a weapon of mass murder. This dual nature of belladonna, medicine and poison, healer and killer, runs through its entire history. The same properties that made it useful for treating illness made it perfect for causing death. The alkaloids atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine that give belladonna its effects don't distinguish between therapeutic use and murderous intent. They simply do what they do, blocking certain nerve signals, causing pupils to dilate, heart rate to increase, smooth muscles to relax, and in high enough doses, causing hallucinations, seizures, and death. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, belladonna's reputation as a poison became so notorious that simply possessing the plant could be seen as evidence of criminal intent. Yet it continued to grow wild across Europe, in forests, along roadsides, in abandoned places where humans rarely ventured. Anyone who knew what to look for could harvest it, and the knowledge of what to do with it, how to prepare it, how to dose it, how to disguise it, circulated in whispered conversations and coded manuscripts. The Age of Enlightenment brought new scientific understanding of belladonna, but it didn't make the plant any less dangerous. If anything, better chemistry made it more lethal, because poisoners learned to extract and concentrate the active compounds, creating more potent and harder to detect preparations. Let's jump forward to the 19th century, where belladonna played a role in one of the most sensational murder cases of the Victorian era. The year is 1856, and we're in England, where a respectable middle-class doctor named William Palmer is about to be exposed as one of Britain's most prolific poisoners. Palmer's story shows how belladonna and other botanical poisons had become tools of the emerging middle class, used not for political assassination, but for profit and personal gain. Palmer was drowning in gambling debts. He'd lost enormous sums betting on horses, and his creditors were closing in. But Palmer had life insurance policies on several people close to him, including his wife, his brother, and a friend named John Cook. When these people began dying under suspicious circumstances, Palmer collected the insurance money and paid off some of his debts. The pattern might have continued unnoticed, but John Cook's death was too suspicious to ignore. Cook had just won a substantial sum at the races and died shortly after, while staying at Palmer's house. Cook's stepfather insisted on an autopsy. The doctors found evidence of antimony poisoning, but they also found traces of alkaloids consistent with belladonna. Palmer's trial became a sensation. The prosecution argued that he'd been systematically poisoning people for years, using his medical knowledge to acquire poisons and disguise the symptoms as natural illness. The defense claimed the evidence was circumstantial and that the deaths could have been from natural causes. Palmer was convicted and hanged, but the case highlighted something disturbing: the increasing availability of botanical poisons and the growing sophistication of those who used them. Victorian England saw a wave of domestic poisonings, often wives poisoning, abusive husbands or husbands poisoning wives for insurance money. Belladonna, arsenic, strychnine, and other easily obtained substances became weapons in an undeclared war within the home. The Victorian era also saw legitimate medical use of belladonna reach its peak. Doctors prescribed belladonna tinctures and extracts for dozens of conditions. It was used to treat Parkinson's disease before modern medications were developed. It was used to examine patients' eyes. The pupil dilation effect made it easier to see internal eye structures. It was used to treat peptic ulcers, irritable bowel syndrome, and various other digestive problems. Pharmaceutical companies began mass-producing belladonna preparations, standardizing doses, and making the medicine more widely available. This was both a blessing and a curse. Standardization made medical use safer and more predictable, but it also made poison more accessible. You could walk into a pharmacy and purchase belladonna tincture with no questions asked. The lack of regulation meant that accidental poisonings became increasingly common. Parents would give children belladonna preparations for colic or teething, sometimes with fatal results when they miscalculated the dose. Adults would take too much for headaches or stomach problems and end up hallucinating or worse. One particularly tragic case from 1872 illustrates the danger. A London family purchased belladonna plasters, medical patches containing belladonna extract to treat the father's back pain. The instructions were unclear, and the family left the plasters on far too long. The father absorbed a massive dose through his skin, began hallucinating, became violent, and died despite the efforts of doctors to save him. The coroner's inquest ruled it an accidental death, but noted that the plasters should never have been available without clearer warnings. The turn of the 20th century brought new forensic techniques that made belladonna poisoning easier to detect. Chemical tests could identify the specific alkaloids in tissue samples from victims. This made murder by belladonna more risky, though it certainly didn't stop everyone. One of the most notorious cases of the early 20th century involved a nurse in Connecticut named Amy Archer Gilligan. Between 1907 and 1917, dozens of elderly patients in her care died under mysterious circumstances. Gilligan ran a nursing home and had a financial incentive. Patients paid her a lump sum for lifetime care. The sooner they died, the more profit she made. Investigators eventually exhumed several bodies and found evidence of poisoning, including traces of belladonna alkaloids in the tissues. Gilligan was convicted of murder and spent the rest of her life in an asylum. The case inspired the play and film Arsenic and Old Lace, though the real story was far darker than the comedy suggested. As medical knowledge advanced, doctors began to understand exactly how belladonna affected the body. The alkaloids block acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that helps nerves communicate with muscles and glands. This is why belladonna causes dry mouth. It stops saliva production. It's why it dilates pupils. It prevents the muscles that constrict the pupil from working. It's why it increases heart rate. It blocks the signals that tell the heart to slow down. In therapeutic doses, these effects can be useful. In toxic doses, they're catastrophic. The heart races out of control. Body temperature soars because sweating stops. The brain, deprived of normal acetylcholine signaling, begins to malfunction, causing confusion, hallucinations, and eventually seizures. Death comes from cardiac arrest or respiratory failure or hypothermia, the body literally cooking itself because it can't cool down. Understanding the mechanism didn't make belladonna less deadly, it just changed how it was used. Medical professionals became more careful with dosing, murderers became more creative in their methods, and belladonna maintained its reputation as one of nature's most perfect killers. World War II brought a new chapter in belladonna's story. Both Allied and Axis powers studied botanical poisons for potential use in warfare and assassination. While chemical weapons got most of the attention, plant-based toxins were also investigated. The Nazis in particular conducted horrific experiments with various poisons, including belladonna extracts, on concentration camp prisoners. They were looking for undetectable methods of assassination that could be used against Allied leaders and resistance fighters. These experiments documented in the war crimes trials after the war, show the depths of human cruelty when medical knowledge is perverted to murderous ends. Allied intelligence services also studied belladonna and other plant toxins. The OSS, predecessor to the CIA, investigated methods of incapacitation and assassination. Belladonna's ability to cause confusion and disorientation made it interesting as a potential truth serum or interrogation tool, though it proved too unpredictable for reliable use. The Cold War era saw continued interest in plant toxins by intelligence agencies on both sides. The KGB allegedly used a modified version of the Bulgarian umbrella technique, where a tiny pellet containing poison could be injected with a spring-loaded umbrella tip. While ricin was the most famous poison used this way, belladonna alkaloids were also studied as potential agents. One documented case from 1978 involved a Soviet defector who fell ill with symptoms consistent with belladonna poisoning after being contacted by a suspicious individual in London. He survived, but the incident suggested that botanical poisons remained part of the spycraft arsenal, even in an age of synthetic chemicals. As we moved into the modern era, belladonna's medical use has declined dramatically. We have better, safer drugs for almost everything belladonna was once used to treat, but the plant hasn't disappeared from medicine entirely. Atropine, one of the alkaloids extracted from belladonna, remains a critical emergency medication. It's used to treat certain types of poisoning, particularly from nerve agents and pesticides. It's used to stabilize heart rhythms in certain cardiac emergencies. It's kept in emergency rooms and ambulances worldwide because despite its dangers, it can also save lives. The other major alkaloid, scopolamine, also remains medically relevant. It's used in patches to prevent motion sickness and in eye drops for examinations. But scopolamine has also gained a sinister modern reputation as a date rape drug, particularly in South America, where it's sometimes extracted from related plants and used to incapacitate victims of robbery or sexual assault. In Colombia, scopolamine-derived crimes became so common that hospitals developed protocols for treating victims, and police began warning tourists about the danger. The drug, blown into someone's face as a powder or slipped into a drink, causes a compliant, suggestible state where victims will hand over valuables or follow attackers without resistance. They often have no memory of the events afterward. This modern criminal use of belladonna's alkaloids shows that despite centuries of increased regulation and forensic capability, plant poisons remain relevant threats. The same properties that Renaissance poisoners exploited still work today. Chemistry hasn't changed. Only our ability to detect and treat poisoning has improved. Belladonna grows wild across Europe and has naturalized in parts of North America. Hikers occasionally encounter it, and sometimes make the fatal mistake of eating the attractive berries. Children are particularly vulnerable, drawn to the shiny black fruits that look like large blueberries. A few such poisonings happen every year. Reminders that nature's poisons don't need human intent to kill. The plant has also gained a following among certain subcultures interested in ethnobotany and consciousness alteration. Online forums discuss methods of preparing belladonna for its hallucinogenic effects, often with a cavalier attitude toward the very real dangers. Emergency room doctors report seeing cases of recreational belladonna poisoning, usually in young people who found instructions online and underestimated the risks. These recreational users are playing a deadly game. Unlike many hallucinogenic plants that have been used safely in traditional contexts for thousands of years, belladonna has never been a reliable recreational drug. The line between a dose that causes interesting effects and one that causes death is razor thin. The experiences are often terrifying rather than enlightening, delirium rather than insight, and permanent damage or death is a very real possibility. Medical toxicologists who treat belladonna poisoning describe it as one of the more challenging poisonings to manage. There's no specific antidote that reverses the effects. Treatment is supportive, cooling the body, controlling seizures, supporting breathing and heart function until the poison metabolizes and clears the system. Patients often require days in intensive care, and even those who survive may have lasting effects. The hallucinations caused by belladonna poisoning are particularly noteworthy because they're so different from other hallucinogenic experiences. Users of LSD or psilocybin mushrooms typically maintain some awareness that they're hallucinating. Belladonna users don't. They experience complete breaks from reality, interacting with people and objects that aren't there, having elaborate conversations with figments of their imagination, with no insight that any of it is false. This is delirium, not psychedelia, and it's far more dangerous. Historical accounts of belladonna hallucinations describe remarkably consistent themes: flying or floating sensations, hence the witches on broomsticks mythology, transformations into animals, particularly cats or birds, encounters with demonic or supernatural entities, feelings of immense power or significance, and often terrifying paranoia and fear. These experiences shaped cultural beliefs about witchcraft, demonic possession, and the supernatural for centuries. How many accused witches were simply women who'd been exposed to belladonna, either intentionally or accidentally? How many demons and spirits were really hallucinations induced by plant alkaloids? We'll never know, but it's worth considering how much of our cultural mythology around the supernatural might have botanical roots. Modern witchcraft communities, particularly those focused on historical practices, have complex relationships with belladonna. Some argue for reclaiming the knowledge that was suppressed during the witch trials. Others point out that the plants are simply too dangerous for contemporary use, especially when safer alternatives exist for almost any purpose belladonna was traditionally used for. The debate highlights a broader question about traditional knowledge and modern safety. Should we preserve and practice historical uses of dangerous plants, accepting the risks as part of authentic tradition? Or should we treat such knowledge as historically interesting but practically obsolete, replaced by safer modern alternatives? There's no easy answer, but the bodies piling up in emergency rooms suggest that caution might be the wiser choice. From ancient Sumer to modern emergency rooms, belladonna has maintained its deadly reputation. This simple plant, growing wild in forests and fields, has killed emperors and peasants, queens and commoners. It's been used with calculating precision by assassins and poisoners, and it's killed accidentally through ignorance or miscalculation. It's been medicine and murder weapon, cosmetic and poison, sacrament and curse. The story of belladonna is ultimately a story about humans and our relationship with the natural world. We've always sought to understand plants, to use them for our benefit, to turn nature's chemistry to our purposes. Sometimes this works beautifully, medicinal plants that ease suffering and save lives. Sometimes it goes horribly wrong, poisons that kill and maim. Belladonna sits right at that knife edge between benefit and harm, embodying both the promise and peril of our attempts to manipulate nature. A few molecules different, and it might be harmless or useless, but evolution shaped it into exactly what it is. A plant so toxic that even moderate exposure can kill, yet so medically useful that we still extract its compounds for use in modern medicine. As the night deepens and you feel sleep approaching, consider this. Somewhere out there, belladonna is growing. In forests, in gardens, maybe in a wild corner of a park near your home. It's producing those alkaloids, following the same biochemical pathways it's followed for millions of years. The plant doesn't care about human history, about all the deaths it's caused or lives it's saved. It simply exists, doing what evolution programmed it to do, creating compounds that protect it from being eaten by producing some of the most potent neurotoxins in nature. And knowing what you know now, would you recognize it if you saw it? Would you know those bell-shaped flowers, those black shiny berries, those dull green leaves? Most people wouldn't. They'd walk right past it, never knowing they'd just encountered one of history's most prolific killers. That's perhaps belladonna's greatest advantage. It hides in plain sight, just another plant among thousands, beautiful and unremarkable, deadly and patient. waiting for the next person who thinks they can control it, use it, benefit from it. But belladonna has taught us, over and over across thousands of years, that nature's poisons demand absolute respect. One mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of overconfidence, and you become just another name in the long list of the dead, another victim of the beautiful lady. The morning light filters through your window, and you're still thinking about that innocent-looking plant with its deadly secrets. But there's so much more to understand about how belladonna actually works inside the human body, and why it became such an effective tool for both healing and killing. Let's talk about what happens when belladonna enters your system. Whether you've eaten the berries, absorbed it through your skin, or received it in some prepared form, the journey is the same. The alkaloids, primarily atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, move rapidly into your bloodstream. Within 15 to 30 minutes, you'll start feeling the first effects. Your mouth goes dry, not just a little dry, but intensely uncomfortably dry. Your tongue feels like leather. Swallowing becomes difficult. This happens because the alkaloids are blocking the signals that tell your salivary glands to produce saliva. It's such a distinctive symptom that experienced physicians could recognize belladonna poisoning just from this sign alone. Your vision starts to blur, especially when you try to focus on close objects. Your pupils are dilating, growing wider and wider, letting in more light than your eyes can comfortably handle. Bright lights become painful, reading becomes impossible. This effect can last for days, even after other symptoms have passed. Renaissance women who used belladonna for beauty sometimes found themselves functionally blind for a week, stumbling through darkened rooms until the effects wore off. Your heart begins to race, faster and faster, pounding in your chest like you've just run a marathon, except you're sitting still. The alkaloids have blocked the vagus nerve, the brake pedal on your heart rate. Now there's only the accelerator, and it's pressed to the floor. Your heart rate can climb to 140, 160 beats per minute or higher. This is exhausting for the heart muscle and dangerous for anyone with underlying cardiac problems. Your skin becomes hot and dry. The sweat glands, like the salivary glands, have been shut down. Your body's cooling system has failed. In hot weather or with physical activity, your core temperature can rise to dangerous levels. Hypothermia, the medical term for overheating, can cause brain damage or death all by itself, even without the other effects of the poison. Then come the mental changes, and this is where belladonna becomes truly terrifying. At lower doses, you might feel restless, agitated, confused. You have trouble focusing your thoughts. Simple tasks become difficult. You might see things that aren't quite there. Shadows moving in your peripheral vision, patterns that seem meaningful but aren't. At higher doses, you enter full delirium. You're no longer in the real world. You see people who aren't there and have long conversations with them. You see objects, animals, entire scenes that exist only in your poisoned mind. You might think you're somewhere completely different, in another time or place. Some people become convinced they can fly, or that they've transformed into animals, or that they're being chased by demons. What makes this different from other hallucinogenic experiences is the complete loss of insight. Someone on LSD or psilocybin usually maintains some awareness that they're having an altered experience. Someone poisoned by belladonna has no such awareness. Everything they're experiencing seems completely real. They'll argue with you if you try to tell them otherwise. They might become aggressive, convinced you're part of whatever paranoid scenario is playing out in their mind. Medieval accounts of demonic possession often describe symptoms perfectly consistent with belladonna poisoning. The victim acts bizarrely, sees things others can't see, speaks to invisible entities, becomes violent, or exhibits superhuman strength fueled by adrenaline and the loss of normal pain signals. Exorcists would perform their rituals, and if the person survived the poisoning on their own, the exorcism would be credited with driving out the demon. If they died, well, the demon had won. The physical manifestations of severe belladonna poisoning are equally disturbing. Victims pick at invisible objects in the air, a behavior so characteristic it has a medical name, carphology. They might strip off their clothing because the hypothermia makes them feel unbearably hot. They might try to climb walls or furniture, convinced they're somewhere else. The combination of delirium, hypothermia, and cardiac stress creates a medical emergency that challenges even modern intensive care units. Without treatment, death can come from several mechanisms. Cardiac arrhythmia, where the racing heart develops an irregular, ineffective rhythm. Respiratory failure, where the muscles that control breathing become affected. Hypothermia, where the brain literally cooks. Seizures that don't stop, or simple exhaustion, where the body's systems pushed beyond their limits for hours or days, simply shut down. But here's what made belladonna so valuable to poisoners throughout history. In the right dose, just below the obviously toxic level, it could cause death that looked entirely natural. An older person, or someone with underlying health problems, might die from what appeared to be a heart attack or stroke. The racing heart, the elevated blood pressure, the stress on the cardiovascular system, all of these could trigger genuine cardiac events that would be attributed to natural causes. Even if poisoning was suspected, proving it was difficult until modern forensic chemistry. The alkaloids break down in the body and don't leave obvious traces like metallic poisons such as arsenic. A skilled poisoner could use belladonna with a reasonable expectation of getting away with murder, especially if the victim was old, sick, or had a history of heart problems. This brings us to one of the most sophisticated poisoning cases in history, one that demonstrates the calculated precision with which belladonna could be used. The case of the French poisoning affair, or the affair of the poisons, that rocked the court of King Louis XIV in the 1670s. Paris in the late 17th century was a hotbed of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and poison merchants who catered to the wealthy and powerful. These individuals operated sophisticated networks that provided everything from love potions to deadly poisons. The most notorious was a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, who ran what was essentially a poison-for-hire business disguised as fortune-telling. La Voisin and her network supplied poisons to nobles, mostly women, who wanted to eliminate inconvenient husbands, rivals, or obstacles to their ambitions. The preferred method was slow poisoning, administering small doses over weeks or months so the victim's death would appear natural. Belladonna was ideal for this purpose, mixed with other substances to mask its effects and confuse any investigation. The scandal broke when the police arrested a fortune-teller who, under interrogation, implicated dozens of nobles in poisoning plots. The investigation eventually reached the highest levels of Louis's court. Even Madame de Montespan, the king's own mistress, was implicated in plots to poison rivals for the king's affection. La Voisin was arrested and eventually burned at the stake, but not before she'd revealed the extent of the poisoning network. Hundreds of people were investigated. Dozens were executed. The affair shocked French society and led to new regulations around the sale of poisons, though these laws were easily circumvented by those with money and connections. What the affair of the poisons demonstrated was how deeply poison had penetrated elite society. It wasn't just a tool of desperate criminals, but an accepted, if secret, method by which the wealthy resolved their problems. Belladonna, arsenic, and other toxins circulated through the upper classes like currency, traded and sold by specialists who understood their properties and effects. The case files from the investigation, preserved in French archives, document hundreds of poisoning deaths over a span of decades. Reading them today is chilling. Husbands slowly wasting away while their wives feigned concern. Children dying young so parents could inherit estates. Mistresses eliminating wives so they could marry their lovers, all accomplished with carefully measured doses of botanical poisons administered in food, wine, or medicines. King Louis was so disturbed by the revelations that he ordered many of the case files destroyed and forbade further investigation, partly to protect the reputation of his court, and partly because the trail led uncomfortably close to people he cared about. The full extent of the poisoning epidemic was never revealed, but historians estimate hundreds, possibly thousands, died in this systematic use of poison among the French aristocracy. The affair of the poisons wasn't unique to France. Similar networks existed in Italy, where the poisoning tradition was even older and more established. In England, where poison was considered an unmanly form of murder, it was less common but still practiced. Throughout Europe, botanical poisons flowed through elite society, silent killers that shaped succession, inheritance, and power in ways that never made it into the official histories. Let's shift our focus to a different aspect of belladonna's history, its use in warfare and as a tool of military strategy. You might think of poison as an individual weapon, something used for assassination or murder. But belladonna has also been used on a larger scale to incapacitate or kill groups of people. Ancient armies knew about belladonna's properties. Some military historians believe that certain legendary incidents of mass madness in military contexts might have been deliberate poisoning. There are accounts of entire military units suddenly becoming incapacitated, seeing visions attacking each other or invisible enemies, before the effects wore off or they died. One particularly well-documented case involves the army of Marcus Antonius during his Parthian campaign in 36 BC. Historical accounts describe his soldiers suffering strange symptoms after consuming local plants, becoming delirious, forgetting who they were, obsessively moving stones from place to place until they collapsed from exhaustion. Many died. The symptoms match belladonna poisoning perfectly, and the plant grew wild in the region they were traversing. Whether the soldiers accidentally consumed belladonna or were deliberately poisoned by Parthian forces remains unclear. But the incident demonstrated the military utility of plant poisons. A small amount of belladonna introduced into an army's food or water supply could incapacitate hundreds of soldiers without a sword being drawn. Medieval sieges sometimes involved attempts to poison the besieged city's water supply. Belladonna, hemlock, and other toxic plants could be dumped into wells or reservoirs, though this was generally ineffective because the plants needed to be prepared and concentrated to have sufficient potency, and dilution in large water supplies reduced effectiveness. More successful were targeted poisoning operations. Assassins would infiltrate enemy camps and poison the food or drink of commanders and officers. A military force with its leadership dead or incapacitated was much easier to defeat. Some medieval military treatises actually included sections on poisoned preparation and antidotes, treating toxicology as a standard military skill like archery or swordsmanship. The evolution of chemistry in the 19th century opened new possibilities for using belladonna in warfare. Scientists learned to extract and concentrate the alkaloids, creating far more potent preparations than the raw plant material. These concentrated alkaloids could theoretically be aerosolized, turned into a fine mist or powder that could be dispersed over enemy positions. During World War I, both sides experimented with various toxic substances as potential weapons. While chlorine gas and mustard gas got most of the attention and use, botanical alkaloids, including those from belladonna, were also studied. The Germans in particular investigated belladonna alkaloids as potential incapacitating agents. The theory was sound. A substance that caused temporary confusion and disorientation without necessarily killing could be valuable for breaking up enemy formations or causing chaos in rear areas. But belladonna alkaloids proved too unpredictable. The dose that would incapacitate one person might kill another depending on body weight, health status, and individual sensitivity, and the delirium it caused was so profound that affected soldiers might be as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. World War II saw renewed interest in botanical weapons, driven partly by concerns that conventional weapons might not be sufficient and partly by the horrific willingness of some regimes to experiment with any method of killing. The Japanese Biological Warfare Unit, Unit 731, experimented with various toxins on Chinese prisoners. While their focus was mainly on disease agents, they also tested botanical poisons including belladonna derivatives. The Nazis conducted similar research in concentration camps, testing various poisons on prisoners to study their effects and search for undetectable methods of assassination. These experiments were war crimes, and the scientists who conducted them were prosecuted after the war, though some escaped justice by offering their knowledge to Allied intelligence services. The Cold War brought belladonna back into military and intelligence circles, but for different purposes. The CIA's MKUltra program, a notorious series of experiments on mind control and behavioral modification, investigated numerous psychoactive substances including scopolamine, one of belladonna's primary alkaloids. The goal wasn't to kill, but to control. Intelligence agencies wanted substances that would make interrogation subjects more compliant, more suggestible, more willing to reveal secrets. Scopolamine seemed promising because it caused a confused, suggestible state where subjects might answer questions without normal inhibitions. The experiments were largely failures. Scopolamine made subjects too confused to give coherent answers. They would confabulate, making up answers that sounded plausible but were completely false. There was no way to distinguish truth from delusion in someone under the influence of the drug. The program moved on to other substances, but the experiments had already caused harm to unwitting test subjects, some of whom suffered lasting psychological damage. Declassified documents from various intelligence agencies reveal that belladonna alkaloids were also studied as potential assassination tools throughout the Cold War. The advantage over other poisons was that scopolamine could be absorbed through the skin, opening up delivery methods that didn't require the target to eat or drink anything. A handshake with a treated glove, a pat on the back with a treated hand, could deliver a potentially lethal dose. There are unconfirmed reports of such techniques being used. A Soviet defector falls ill with mysterious symptoms after contact with a suspected agent. A political dissident in a South American dictatorship dies after a strange encounter with government operatives. These incidents are difficult to prove decades later, but the pattern suggests that belladonna remained in the toolkit of state-sponsored assassination programs well into the late 20th century. Today, military interest in belladonna is minimal. Modern chemical weapons are more effective if the goal is to kill, and less toxic compounds are better if the goal is temporary incapacitation. But atropine, extracted from belladonna, remains crucial in military medicine as an antidote to nerve agents. Soldiers carry autoinjectors loaded with atropine because it can counteract the effects of chemical weapons like sarin or VX gas. The irony is profound. A poison that has killed thousands throughout history is now a life-saving medication for soldiers exposed to even deadlier synthetic poisons. This duality captures everything complex about humanity's relationship with toxic plants. We fear them, study them, weaponize them, and sometimes we figure out how to use them to save lives. Let's turn our attention to a different thread in belladonna's history, one that's often overlooked but equally fascinating. The plant's role in religious and mystical practices across different cultures and time periods. We've already touched on the use of belladonna in ancient Greek temples where priestesses used it to induce prophetic visions, but this tradition extended far beyond Greece. Shamanic cultures across Europe and Asia used belladonna and related plants containing similar alkaloids as tools for communicating with the spirit world, healing the sick, or traveling to other realms of consciousness. The distinction between poison and sacrament, between toxic delirium and divine vision, was often a matter of cultural interpretation and dose. What ancient cultures called communing with the gods or traveling to the underworld, modern medicine calls anticholinergic delirium. But the subjective experiences, the visions, the sense of leaving one's body, the encounters with entities and forces beyond normal perception were real to those who experienced them, and they shaped religious beliefs and practices for thousands of years. In some Slavic folk traditions, belladonna was considered a plant of powerful magic, dangerous to use but potentially valuable for those with the knowledge and courage to work with it. Folk healers would use tiny amounts in healing preparations, always with elaborate rituals and precautions. The rituals served a practical purpose beyond any spiritual significance. They created a formal, careful approach to handling a dangerous substance, reducing the risk of accidental poisoning. The association of belladonna with witchcraft in medieval Europe was rooted in these older traditions. The flying ointments we discussed earlier weren't inventions of the medieval period. but continuations of practices that stretched back to pre-Christian times. The witch hunts suppressed these traditions, driving them underground, but they never completely disappeared. Modern anthropological research has documented the survival of belladonna use in folk medicine and magic in remote European communities well into the 20th century. In some areas of Eastern Europe, traditional healers still maintained knowledge of belladonna and related plants, using them in carefully controlled ways for specific purposes. But here's the crucial difference between traditional use and modern recreational experimentation. Traditional use was embedded in cultural contexts with strict rules, rigorous training, and an understanding built over generations of careful observation. Modern users, following instructions from internet forums, lack this context and wisdom. They're playing with forces they don't understand, using a plant whose effects they can't control, and the results are predictably tragic. Emergency medicine physicians report seeing periodic waves of belladonna poisonings, often connected to internet subcultures that romanticize natural hallucinogens. Young people read about shamanic traditions or medieval witchcraft, decide to experiment with belladonna, and end up in intensive care units, if they're lucky, or dead, if they're not. The experiences these recreational users report, when they survive to report them, are almost universally negative. Unlike psilocybin or ayahuasca experiences that users often describe as meaningful or insightful, belladonna experiences are typically terrifying. Paranoid delusions, horrifying hallucinations, complete loss of control, hours or days of nightmare reality with no escape. Medical literature contains numerous case reports of belladonna poisonings from recreational use. A 19-year-old who thought he could fly and jumped from a third-floor window, suffering multiple fractures. A young woman who became convinced her friends were demons trying to kill her and attacked them with a knife. A college student who wandered into traffic during a belladonna-induced delirium and was struck by a car. These aren't cautionary tales invented to scare people. They're real cases documented in medical journals, tragic consequences of treating a powerful poison as a recreational drug. The internet has made information about belladonna more available than ever before. You can find detailed descriptions of its effects, methods of preparation, dosing guidelines, but this information is often incomplete or dangerously wrong. The variability of alkaloid content in different plants, in different parts of the same plant, at different times of year, means that dosing based on internet advice is essentially Russian roulette. Some people have argued for harm reduction approaches, providing safer information for those who are going to use belladonna regardless of warnings. But most toxicologists and physicians reject this approach for belladonna specifically, arguing that there is no safe recreational use of the plant. The therapeutic window, the range between a dose that produces desired effects and one that causes toxicity or death, is too narrow. The effects are too unpredictable, the risks are too severe. This stands in contrast to other plant medicines that have been successfully integrated into modern therapeutic contexts. Psilocybin from magic mushrooms is being studied for treating depression and PTSD. MDMA-derived principles are showing promise for therapy. Cannabis has been legalized for medical and recreational use in many jurisdictions, but belladonna has no such future. It's simply too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to cause harm. The medical uses of belladonna have largely been replaced by synthetic drugs that provide similar benefits with better safety profiles. Modern mydriatics, drugs that dilate the pupil for eye exams, are safer and more predictable than belladonna. Modern antispasmodics for digestive issues are more effective and cause fewer side effects. Even atropine, when used medically, is typically a synthetic version rather than plant extracted. But belladonna continues to be used in homeopathy, a controversial alternative medicine system. Homeopathic preparations of belladonna are diluted to the point where little or no actual alkaloid remains, theoretically making them safe. Mainstream medicine regards homeopathy as pseudoscience with no mechanism of action beyond placebo effect. But homeopathic belladonna preparations are widely sold and used, particularly in Europe for conditions ranging from fever to headaches to sleep problems. The debate around homeopathic belladonna raises interesting questions. If a preparation is so diluted that it contains no measurable amount of the original substance, can it cause the effects attributed to it? Most scientific evidence says no, but users report benefits, whether from placebo effect, natural resolution of symptoms, or some mechanism not yet understood. What concerns physicians is when people use homeopathic preparations instead of proven medical treatments for serious conditions. Delaying real treatment in favor of ineffective remedies can allow diseases to progress to dangerous stages. Children have died because parents treated serious infections with homeopathic remedies rather than antibiotics. This isn't a problem with homeopathy specifically, but with any alternative treatment that displaces effective medical care. As night deepens and your mind processes all this information about belladonna's complex history and continuing presence, certain themes emerge. This is a plant that has shaped human history in ways most people never realize. It's killed emperors and peasants. It's been medicine and poison, sacrament and curse, cosmetic and weapon. The story of belladonna is ultimately about power, the power of those who controlled knowledge about the plant, who understood its preparation and use, the power to heal or harm, to save lives or take them, the power that came from controlling access to something simultaneously valuable and dangerous. Throughout history, this knowledge has been guarded, suppressed, transmitted secretly, lost and rediscovered. Physicians kept their poison knowledge private, sharing it only with trusted students. Poisoners created networks and guilds with their own rules and traditions. Folk healers passed down plant lore through generations, often in coded or symbolic language that protected the knowledge from outsiders. The democratization of information in the modern era has made this knowledge more accessible, but not necessarily safer. Reading about belladonna on the internet doesn't convey the hard-won wisdom of generations of careful use. It doesn't teach the respect that traditional practitioners developed for powerful plants, and it doesn't compensate for the variability and unpredictability that make belladonna so dangerous. The morning mist hangs heavy over the Scottish Highlands in the year 1743, and we're about to witness one of the most bizarre and little-known military incidents involving belladonna. A Jacobite rebel camp, preparing for battle against British forces, wakes to find their sentries behaving strangely. Men are laughing at nothing, staggering in circles, conversing with invisible companions. Within hours, dozens of soldiers are incapacitated, seeing phantom armies marching across the hills, convinced they're fighting battles that exist only in their poisoned minds. The cause was never officially determined, but camp records and personal diaries suggest someone had contaminated the evening's soup with belladonna. Whether it was sabotage by British spies, an accident by foragers who mistook the plant for something edible, or deliberate poisoning by someone within the camp settling a personal grudge, the Jacobites never discovered. What matters is that a significant portion of their force was combat ineffective for 3 days, possibly changing the outcome of battles we remember very differently. This incident, largely forgotten by mainstream history, illustrates something crucial about belladonna. Its effects are so dramatic and distinctive that they create stories, legends, and mysteries that ripple through time. Let's explore some of the strangest, most fascinating, and least known incidents involving this deadly plant. In 1792, during the French Revolution's reign of terror, a peculiar epidemic struck a women's prison in Paris. Over the course of a week, more than 30 imprisoned aristocratic women developed identical symptoms: dilated pupils, racing hearts, fever, and most disturbingly vivid hallucinations where they saw their dead relatives calling to them from the walls. Prison officials feared an outbreak of some supernatural plague, a divine punishment perhaps, or the revenge of executed nobles reaching from beyond the grave. The true cause was far more earthly and more sinister. A guard, taking pity on the condemned women, or perhaps seeking some twisted revenge, had been gradually introducing belladonna extract into their daily bread ration, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to cause days of delirium and terror before their scheduled executions. When the plot was discovered, The guard claimed he was showing mercy, giving the women visions of their lost loved ones before death. He was executed alongside them, though whether his motive was truly mercy or cruelty remains debated by historians who study this dark footnote of the revolution. Cross the Atlantic to colonial America in the early 1800s, and belladonna appears again in unexpected contexts. The Shakers, a religious community known for their furniture and celibate lifestyle, maintained extensive herb gardens where they grew medicinal plants for sale. Belladonna was one of their most profitable crops, carefully cultivated and prepared into tinctures and extracts that they sold to physicians and apothecaries across the growing nation. The Shakers kept meticulous records, and these documents reveal fascinating details about belladonna cultivation and preparation. They noted that plants grown in shadier locations produced more potent alkaloids. They discovered that harvesting at specific times of day and specific phases of the moon, though they didn't understand why, resulted in more consistent potency. Modern chemistry would later confirm that alkaloid production in belladonna does vary with circadian rhythms and environmental conditions, but the Shakers figured this out through careful observation and record keeping. What's particularly interesting is how the Shakers balanced their religious convictions about purity and healing with the knowledge that they were growing and selling a substance that could easily kill. Their internal writings show an ongoing theological debate about whether providing dangerous medicines was compatible with their faith. They ultimately decided that medicines, like tools, were morally neutral. The sin lay in misuse, not in the substance itself. This pragmatic approach allowed them to become one of the largest suppliers of medicinal belladonna in 19th century America. But not all of their belladonna went to legitimate medical use. Shaker journals document several instances where they refused sales to suspicious buyers or reported concerns to local authorities. In one case from 1824, a woman attempted to purchase an unusually large quantity of belladonna extract. When questioned about her intended use, she claimed she needed it for chronic stomach problems. The Shaker pharmacist, suspicious of the quantity and the woman's evasive answers, refused the sale and alerted the local sheriff. Investigation revealed that the woman's husband was a wealthy merchant who had recently changed his will to leave everything to a younger mistress. The wife had planned to slowly poison him over several months, making his death appear like a natural decline. The Shaker's intervention saved the merchant's life and sent his wife to prison. The community took pride in this incident, seeing it as proof that their careful stewardship of dangerous medicines served God's purpose. Meanwhile, in the American South, belladonna played a different and darker role. Plantation owners discovered that small amounts of belladonna could be used to manage enslaved workers, reducing rebellion through subtle chemical control. The practice was never widespread or officially documented, but private letters and slave narratives reference mysterious illnesses that caused confusion and compliance, particularly in slaves who had shown resistant behavior. This represents one of the most horrific applications of botanical knowledge, using medicine as a tool of oppression and control. The dosing was calibrated to cause just enough cognitive impairment to make organized resistance difficult, without causing obvious illness that might reduce work capacity. Enslaved people who understood plants sometimes recognized what was happening and found ways to counteract or avoid the poisoning, but the power imbalance made resistance extremely difficult and dangerous. After emancipation, some formerly enslaved people shared their knowledge of how plantation owners had used various plants for control, but this history was largely ignored or dismissed by mainstream historians. Only in recent decades have researchers begun seriously examining this aspect of slavery, recognizing that chemical control was another weapon in the arsenal of oppression, alongside physical violence and legal restrictions. Let's shift to Victorian England, where belladonna's story takes another strange turn through the world of theatre and entertainment. Stage performers discovered that small doses of belladonna could enhance their performances in specific ways. The pupil dilation made their eyes more expressive and visible to audiences in dimly lit theatres, The slight increase in heart rate and alertness helped overcome stage fright and boost energy during long performances. Tragic actresses in particular favored belladonna. The dilated pupils combined with pale makeup created an otherworldly ethereal appearance that audiences found mesmerizing. The drug's tendency to reduce inhibition helped performers deliver emotionally intense scenes with greater conviction. Of course, this came with risks. Performers might misjudge their dose and find themselves genuinely delirious on stage, unable to remember lines or distinguish between the performance and reality. Theatre journals from the Victorian era document several incidents where performances had to be stopped because actors were clearly in medical distress from belladonna. In one infamous case from 1876, a production of Hamlet came to a halt when both the actor playing Hamlet and the actress playing Ophelia, both using belladonna to enhance their performances, became simultaneously incapacitated during the mad scene. The audience initially thought it was brilliant method acting until stagehands had to carry both actors off while they ranted incoherently at invisible spectres. The practice was so common that theatre managers began including clauses in contracts forbidding the use of belladonna and other drugs before performances. But enforcement was nearly impossible, and many performers continued the practice despite the risks. Some rationalized that the greatest actors throughout history had used various substances to enhance their craft, from ancient Greek performers who consumed hallucinogenic plants to achieve divine inspiration, to modern performers who might rely on alcohol or other drugs. The theatrical use of belladonna created an unexpected medical problem. Physicians began seeing patients with unusual symptom patterns, particularly women who presented with chronic dilated pupils, irregular heart rates, and intermittent episodes of confusion. Investigation often revealed that these women were aspiring actresses or socially ambitious women who had learned about belladonna's cosmetic effects and were using it regularly, developing chronic toxicity. One particularly well-documented case involved a young woman in London who used belladonna eye drops daily for 2 years to maintain the fashionable wide-eyed look. She gradually developed permanent vision problems, chronic tachycardia, and cognitive difficulties. By the time physicians identified the cause, the damage was irreversible. She spent her final years in progressive blindness and mental deterioration, a cautionary tale that medical journals published as a warning against cosmetic belladonna use. But perhaps no period in belladonna's history is stranger than its brief popularity as a weight loss aid in the early 20th century. Pharmaceutical companies, in an era of minimal regulation, began marketing belladonna-containing pills as appetite suppressants and metabolism boosters. The advertising claimed these pills would help women achieve the fashionably slim figure of the 1920s flapper era without dietary restriction or exercise. The mechanism, such as it was, relied on belladonna's tendency to cause dry mouth and nausea at certain doses, which naturally reduced appetite. The increased heart rate was marketed as metabolism boosting, though in reality it was just the cardiac stress of poisoning. The products were remarkably popular, sold through pharmacies and mail-order catalogs with testimonials from satisfied customers who had lost significant weight. What the advertising didn't mention was that the weight loss was often from dehydration, nausea-induced reduction in eating, and the general systemic stress of chronic low-grade poisoning. Users developed tolerance, requiring increasing doses to maintain effects, leading to progressively worse toxicity. Deaths were reported but often attributed to other causes, as the connection between the diet pills and fatal outcomes wasn't immediately obvious. The scandal broke in 1933 when a socialite in New York died suddenly at a fashionable party. The autopsy revealed massive belladonna overdose, and investigation uncovered that she had been taking a popular brand of diet pills at triple the recommended dose, desperate to lose weight before an important social event. The publicity led to investigations of the diet pill industry, eventually contributing to stronger pharmaceutical regulations, though belladonna-containing products remained available for years afterward. This incident reveals something important about humanity's relationship with dangerous substances. The desire for beauty, thinness, enhanced performance, or altered consciousness is so strong that people will take enormous risks, ignoring or rationalizing clear dangers. Belladonna has served every one of these desires at different points in history, and people have paid the price repeatedly, yet each generation seems to rediscover the plant and repeat the same mistakes. Now let's travel to World War I battlefields, where belladonna appears in an unexpected medical context. Military physicians discovered that soldiers exposed to certain chemical weapons, particularly early nerve agents, responded positively to atropine injections. This was humanity's first glimpse of what would become atropine's most important modern use as an antidote to nerve agent poisoning. The discovery happened almost by accident. A British medical officer treating soldiers exposed to an experimental German gas attack tried various treatments in desperation. When he administered belladonna extract to one dying soldier, expecting it to ease suffering in the final moments, the soldier's condition stabilized and gradually improved. The physician documented this carefully, replicated the treatment with other patients, and reported his findings to military medical authorities. Research during and after the war confirmed that atropine could counteract certain types of chemical weapon exposure by blocking the overstimulation of the nervous system that these weapons caused. This discovery saved countless lives and led to atropine becoming standard issue for soldiers in chemical warfare environments. The auto-injectors carried by modern military personnel, containing a measured dose of atropine ready for immediate use if exposed to nerve agents, are direct descendants of that World War I battlefield innovation. The irony is profound and worth emphasizing. A plant that had killed people for thousands of years, that had been a weapon of assassins and poisoners, became a life-saving antidote to even more terrible poisons. The same molecular mechanism that makes belladonna toxic, its blockade of acetylcholine receptors, is exactly what makes it effective against nerve agents that cause excessive acetylcholine stimulation. This medical breakthrough coincided with another dark chapter in belladonna's story. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 saw desperate people turning to any treatment that might help. Folk remedies experienced a resurgence as conventional medicine proved helpless against the virus. Some traditional healers recommended belladonna preparations, claiming they could reduce fever and ease breathing difficulties. In small, carefully measured doses, belladonna might have provided some symptomatic relief. It could reduce excessive secretions, ease muscle aches, and help patients rest. But in the panic of the pandemic, people often took too much, either through mistake or desperation. Hospitals already overwhelmed with flu patients began seeing cases of obvious belladonna poisoning mixed in with the viral illness, complicating treatment and adding to the death toll. Medical journals from the period document the challenge physicians faced in distinguishing between severe influenza, belladonna poisoning, and patients suffering from both simultaneously. The symptoms overlapped significantly. High fever, rapid heartbeat, confusion, respiratory distress could all be caused by either condition. Some patients with moderate flu who might have recovered were killed by belladonna taken as treatment. Others with severe flu experienced additional suffering from poisoning on top of their viral illness. The pandemic eventually passed, but it left lessons about the dangers of unregulated folk remedies and the importance of accurate medical information during public health crises. These lessons, unfortunately, were largely forgotten by the time the next pandemic struck over a century later. Let's move into the Prohibition era in America, where belladonna found yet another unexpected application. Bootleggers and speakeasy owners discovered they could use small amounts of belladonna extract to adulterate cheap alcohol, making it seem more potent than it actually was. The racing heart, flushed skin, and mild disorientation from low-dose belladonna mimicked the effects of stronger alcohol, allowing them to water down their product while still delivering an experience customers would pay for. This practice was incredibly dangerous. The variability of belladonna preparations meant that dosing was inconsistent. A batch that produced the desired mild effects could be followed by one that caused severe toxicity. Multiple deaths were attributed to poisoned bootleg alcohol during Prohibition, and while most attention focused on methanol and other industrial alcohols used in illegal spirits, belladonna contributed its share to the body count. Federal agents investigating illegal alcohol operations sometimes found belladonna plants growing near stills or extracts and preparations stored alongside the alcohol production equipment. Treasury Department records document seizures of belladonna-tainted alcohol and arrests of bootleggers who used it. Though these cases were often overshadowed by the larger story of alcohol prohibition and organized crime, the end of prohibition didn't entirely end the practice. Even after repeal, some unscrupulous bar owners continued adulterating drinks with various substances to stretch their inventory or create stronger effects. Belladonna largely fell out of favor for this purpose as better alternatives became available, but isolated cases continued to appear for decades. Now we come to one of the most disturbing modern uses of belladonna-derived compounds. In Colombia and other parts of South America, criminal organizations discovered that scopolamine, extracted and purified from belladonna and related plants, was an effective tool for robbery and sexual assault. They called it devil's breath, and it became one of the most feared substances in the region. The criminal's method was frighteningly simple. Scopolamine powder would be blown into a victim's face or surreptitiously added to food or drink. Within minutes, the victim entered a suggestible compliant state. They remained conscious and able to walk, talk, and follow instructions, but their will was compromised. They would cooperate with their attackers, handing over bank cards and PIN numbers, leading attackers to their homes, or accompanying them to secondary locations. The truly horrifying aspect was the amnesia. Victims often had no memory of what happened during the hours they were under the drug's influence. They might wake up in an unfamiliar location, discover their bank accounts emptied, realize they'd been sexually assaulted, with no recollection of the events. This made prosecution extremely difficult, as victims couldn't testify about what had happened, and the lack of memory created psychological trauma on top of the physical crimes. Colombian hospitals developed protocols for treating suspected scopolamine victims, recognizing the characteristic signs and providing supportive care until the drug metabolized. Police began warning tourists about the danger, advising them never to accept food or drink from strangers and to be cautious in certain areas known for high rates of these crimes. The international attention on scopolamine crimes led to stricter control of belladonna and related plants in affected regions, but enforcement was difficult. The plants grew wild, and extracting and purifying scopolamine didn't require sophisticated laboratory equipment. Criminal organizations adapted, and the crimes continued, though perhaps at reduced rates. This modern criminal application of belladonna's alkaloids demonstrates that despite all our technological advancement, despite synthetic drugs and modern chemistry, plants retain their power to harm in the hands of those who understand their properties and lack moral restraint. Let's explore a completely different thread in belladonna's story, its role in veterinary medicine and its effects on animals. Throughout history, animals have been both accidental victims of belladonna poisoning and deliberate subjects of its medicinal use. Livestock poisoning from belladonna was relatively common in regions where the plant grew wild. Cattle, horses, sheep and goats would sometimes consume the plant while grazing, particularly in late summer and fall when other forage was scarce. The results varied by species and amount consumed, but severe poisoning often resulted in death. Interestingly, different animal species show varying sensitivity to belladonna. Rabbits can consume amounts that would kill a human with minimal effects. Some bird species can eat the berries safely. This variation confused early naturalists who observed animals eating belladonna without harm and concluded it must be safe for humans, a mistake that led to numerous poisonings. Medieval horse traders discovered that belladonna had a cosmetic effect on horses similar to its effect on humans. A small dose would dilate a horse's pupils and increase its animation and liveliness, making older or sick horses appear younger and healthier. This deceptive practice became common enough that experienced horse buyers learned to recognize the signs of belladonna treatment and became suspicious of horses with unusually dilated pupils and excited behavior. Veterinary texts from the 19th century document the use of belladonna preparations in treating various animal ailments. It was used for colic in horses, digestive problems in cattle, and various other conditions. Veterinarians had to calculate doses carefully based on the animal's size and species, and mistakes were common. Farm records from the period occasionally note the loss of valuable animals to what was clearly belladonna poisoning, either accidental or from therapeutic overdose. One particularly strange historical footnote involves deliberate poisoning of animals for commercial purposes. In the early days of animal research and pharmaceutical development, researchers needed to study the effects of various substances on living systems. Belladonna was commonly used in these experiments, and the results helped establish the scientific understanding of how the alkaloids affected different biological systems. These experiments, viewed through a modern lens, were often cruel and scientifically questionable, but they did contribute to medical knowledge, including the discovery of atropine's antidote properties and the development of dosing guidelines that made medical use safer for humans. This raises uncomfortable ethical questions about the price of medical progress and whether the ends justified the means. Moving into the 20th century, belladonna's role in veterinary medicine declined as safer alternatives became available, following the same pattern as in human medicine. But atropine extracted from belladonna remained important in veterinary emergency medicine, used to treat various types of poisoning and to stabilize animals in cardiac distress. Let's shift perspective and consider belladonna from a botanical and ecological standpoint. Why does this plant produce such potent alkaloids? What evolutionary advantage do these compounds provide? The answer lies in plant defense. Belladonna's alkaloids are incredibly effective at deterring herbivores. Most animals that eat significant amounts of the plant either die or become so ill that they learn to avoid it. The alkaloids are the plant's chemical weapon system, defending it against being eaten into extinction. But why does the plant produce berries that are attractive and somewhat edible if the goal is to deter consumption? The answer is complex and involves evolutionary trade-offs. The berries need to be consumed by species that can tolerate the alkaloids and will disperse the seeds. Birds, particularly thrushes and blackbirds in Europe, can eat the berries without harm and deposit the seeds in their droppings far from the parent plant, facilitating the plant's spread. The shiny black berries aren't designed to attract humans. They're designed for birds who see colors differently than mammals and are attracted to dark berries. That humans, particularly children, also find them attractive is an unfortunate coincidence that has led to countless poisonings throughout history. Belladonna's alkaloid content varies significantly based on growing conditions. Plants growing in nitrogen-rich soil produce more alkaloids. Stressed plants, those dealing with drought or pest pressure, ramp up alkaloid production as a defense response. Even different parts of the same plant contain varying concentrations, with roots typically having the highest levels, followed by leaves, then berries. This variability is crucial to understanding belladonna's history. A preparation made from one batch of plants might be relatively weak, while an identical preparation from a different batch could be lethally strong. This inconsistency made medical use dangerous and made poisoning outcomes unpredictable. You couldn't reliably know how potent your belladonna preparation was without testing it, and testing meant giving it to someone and observing the effects. Modern analysis has identified over a dozen different alkaloids in belladonna, though atropine, scopolamine and hyoscyamine account for most of the pharmacological activity. The ratios of these compounds vary between plants and affect the specific symptoms and severity of poisoning. This chemical complexity made belladonna's effects somewhat unpredictable, even when dose was carefully controlled. From an ecological perspective, belladonna is a moderately successful plant. It's not particularly aggressive or invasive, but it maintains stable populations throughout its native range. Human activity has actually helped spread it to new regions where it's naturalized in some areas and remains an introduced curiosity in others. Climate change may be affecting belladonna's distribution and potency. Warmer temperatures and changing rainfall patterns could shift where the plant grows successfully and might alter its alkaloid production. Some researchers have suggested that environmental stress from climate change could actually make belladonna more toxic as the plant responds to stress by increasing its chemical defenses. This raises an interesting question for the future. If belladonna becomes more widespread or more toxic due to environmental changes, could we see an increase in accidental poisonings? Should public health authorities be monitoring belladonna populations and educating people about identification and avoidance? Let's return to human history and explore belladonna's role in some lesser-known historical events. During the Russian Revolution and subsequent civil war, belladonna poisoning was used as a weapon by various factions. Both Bolshevik forces and White Russian opposition employed poisoners who used belladonna among other toxins to eliminate political enemies, disrupt enemy camps, and sow chaos in opposing territories. Soviet archives, partially opened after the fall of the USSR, contain references to specialized units trained in the use of poisons including botanical toxins. These units operated throughout the revolutionary period and continued in various forms under Stalin's rule. Belladonna's advantage in this context was its availability. Russian physicians and herbalists understood it well, and it could be prepared without sophisticated equipment. One documented incident from 1919 involved a White Russian garrison that suffered mass illness after their food supply was contaminated. Of approximately 200 soldiers, over 100 became severely ill with symptoms consistent with belladonna poisoning. The garrison was overrun while the soldiers were incapacitated. Whether this was deliberate poisoning, accidental contamination, or even natural illness misattributed to poisoning remains unclear, but contemporary accounts suspected belladonna. In China during the warlord period and subsequent conflicts, similar stories emerge of belladonna being used for military and political purposes. Traditional Chinese medicine had its own understanding of belladonna and related plants, and this knowledge was weaponized during periods of conflict. The full extent of belladonna's use in 20th century conflicts will probably never be known. Many incidents were never documented or remain in sealed archives. Others were attributed to disease or natural causes when poison was actually responsible. The plant has faded from most modern military thinking, replaced by more reliable and controllable weapons, but its legacy in military history is more extensive than most people realize. As we continue through belladonna's story, another fascinating aspect emerges in its intersection with forensic science and criminal investigation. The development of forensic toxicology, the science of detecting poisons in bodies and crime scenes, was driven partly by the need to catch belladonna poisoners. Early forensic scientists faced enormous challenges in detecting plant alkaloids. Unlike metallic poisons like arsenic, which could be detected through chemical tests known since the early 19th century, alkaloids were organic compounds that broke down in the body and were present in tiny quantities difficult to isolate and identify. The breakthrough came with advances in analytical chemistry in the mid to late 19th century. Scientists developed extraction techniques that could isolate alkaloids from tissue samples. They discovered chemical tests that could identify specific alkaloids based on their reactions with various reagents, and they developed biological tests giving the suspected poison to animals and observing the characteristic effects. One famous case that helped establish forensic toxicology involved a suspected poisoning in France in 1850. A woman was accused of murdering her husband with belladonna. The victim had died with symptoms consistent with poisoning, but proving it required detecting the alkaloids in his tissues weeks after death and burial. The chemist called to examine the case developed new extraction techniques specifically for this investigation, successfully isolating atropine from the victim's organs. He then demonstrated that the compound was indeed atropine by conducting experiments showing it had the characteristic effects on animal pupils and heart rate. The evidence was compelling enough for conviction, and the case established precedents for admitting forensic toxicology evidence in court. As forensic science advanced through the 20th century, detecting belladonna poisoning became increasingly reliable. Modern techniques like gas chromatography mass spectrometry can detect and quantify belladonna alkaloids at incredibly low concentrations. This made murder by belladonna much more difficult to get away with. But forensic advances didn't eliminate belladonna poisoning, they just changed the calculus for poisoners. Some still attempted it, gambling that their crime would be attributed to natural causes and never investigated thoroughly. Others moved to more exotic poisons less likely to be tested for. And some simply didn't care about being caught, using poison impulsively or in situations where they expected to escape before the crime was discovered. The psychological profile of poisoners has been studied extensively by criminologists and forensic psychiatrists. People who poison others tend to be different from those who use more direct forms of violence. Poisoning is intimate, requiring access to the victim's food or drink, but it's also distant, not requiring the poisoner to be present when death occurs. Poisoners are often described as having certain characteristics. They may be intelligent and calculating, able to plan complex crimes over extended periods. They often have access to their victims through caretaking roles, nurses, family members, cooks. They may be motivated by financial gain, inheritance, insurance, or they may be driven by revenge, jealousy, or simply the desire to exercise power over life and death. Belladonna's history shows us examples of all these types. The calculating Borgias using poison as a political tool. The desperate wives trying to escape abusive marriages or secure inheritances. The sadistic nurses who killed patients under their care. The jealous rivals eliminating competition for affection or position. The substance remains neutral. The evil lies entirely in human intention and action. In recent decades, belladonna poisoning has become relatively rare in developed countries, at least in terms of deliberate murder. When it does occur, it's usually accidental, from foraging mistakes or recreational experimentation, or it's deliberate self-harm, suicide attempts using plant material. This shift reflects both better forensic capability making murder more difficult, and the availability of other more reliable methods for those intent on harming themselves or others. But in parts of the world with less developed forensic infrastructure, belladonna and other plant poisons likely continue to cause deaths that go undetected or uninvestigated. The plant grows wild in many regions, the knowledge of its use persists in some communities, and the lack of thorough death investigation means that murders can be disguised as natural deaths just as they were centuries ago. As darkness falls again and you process this overwhelming history, one fact becomes inescapable. Belladonna has been a constant companion of human civilization, adapting to each era's particular needs and horrors. From ancient temples to modern emergency rooms, from royal courts to criminal underworlds, from battlefield medicine to date rape drugs, this plant has touched virtually every aspect of human experience. The beautiful lady, as Renaissance Italians named her, has proven to be the most faithless of companions, offering beauty and relief with one hand while dealing death and madness with the other. And yet we can't seem to leave her alone. Every generation rediscovers belladonna, and every generation pays the price for underestimating her. The first rays of dawn break over a modern research laboratory, and scientists in white coats are studying belladonna once again. But this time they're not looking for ways to kill, they're searching for ways to save lives, and the irony would be amusing if the stakes weren't so high. After thousands of years as humanity's enemy, belladonna might finally be revealing secrets that could benefit rather than destroy us. Modern pharmaceutical research has discovered that the same molecular mechanisms that make belladonna toxic might also hold keys to treating certain diseases. Researchers are investigating whether modified versions of belladonna alkaloids could treat Parkinson's disease more effectively than current medications. They're exploring whether the compounds might help with certain types of chronic pain that don't respond to conventional treatments. They're even studying whether components of belladonna might have applications in treating some forms of addiction. This research is painstaking and expensive. Every potential medication derived from belladonna must be carefully modified to preserve beneficial effects while minimizing toxicity. The therapeutic window must be widened enough that doctors can prescribe it safely. Clinical trials must demonstrate both efficacy and safety across diverse populations. It's the opposite of how belladonna was used throughout most of history, where the goal was often maximum toxicity with minimum detection. One particularly promising avenue involves using synthetic analogues of scopolamine for treating severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Early clinical trials have shown that a single carefully controlled dose administered in a medical setting under close supervision can produce rapid improvements in some patients who haven't responded to conventional antidepressants. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but it appears to involve scopolamine's effects on certain neurotransmitter systems in the brain. The researchers conducting these trials are acutely aware of the ethical complexities. They're working with a substance that has caused immeasurable suffering throughout history, trying to transform it into something that relieves suffering. They're taking something associated with crime and murder and attempting to make it into legitimate medicine. The irony isn't lost on them, and their published papers often include historical notes acknowledging belladonna's dark past. But modern research isn't limited to finding new medical uses. Scientists are also studying belladonna to understand fundamental questions about plant evolution, chemical ecology, and the biological basis of consciousness. Why do these particular alkaloids affect mammalian nervous systems so profoundly? What evolutionary pressures led to their development? How do the molecular structures of these compounds interact with receptors in our brains and bodies? These questions might seem academic, but answering them has practical implications. Understanding exactly how belladonna alkaloids work at the molecular level helps us design better medications and antidotes. It helps us predict which other plants might have similar effects and need similar cautions. It contributes to the broader understanding of how drugs affect the nervous system, knowledge that applies far beyond belladonna specifically. Genetic research on belladonna has revealed fascinating details about how the plant produces its alkaloids. The biosynthetic pathway, the series of chemical reactions that convert basic building blocks into atropine and scopolamine, involves numerous enzymes encoded by specific genes. Scientists have mapped these genes and are beginning to understand how they're regulated. This knowledge could theoretically allow the creation of belladonna plants with modified alkaloid profiles, perhaps producing only the medically useful compounds without the most toxic ones. Such genetic modification raises its own ethical questions. Should we be creating modified versions of deadly plants? What happens if these modified plants escape into the wild and crossbreed with natural populations? Could we inadvertently create something even more dangerous than the original? These questions don't have simple answers, and they're being debated in scientific journals, ethics committees, and regulatory agencies. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, belladonna continues its ancient role in traditional medicine and folk practice. In some rural European communities, elderly women still maintain knowledge of belladonna and other medicinal plants, though they're increasingly reluctant to share this knowledge with younger generations who might misuse it or might not understand the respect and caution required. Anthropologists and ethnobotanists have documented these traditional practices, creating records of knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Their work reveals sophisticated understanding developed over generations of careful observation. Traditional practitioners in some regions can identify belladonna's potency by subtle visual cues, adjusting their preparations based on where and when the plant was harvested, what the weather was like, how the leaves smell and feel. This embodied knowledge, developed through experience rather than laboratory analysis, represents a different way of understanding plants that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. But this traditional knowledge is fading. Young people in these communities often have no interest in learning about dangerous plants. They have access to modern medicine and see no reason to maintain practices that carry significant risk. Within a generation or two, much of this knowledge will be gone, preserved only in academic papers and ethnographic films. Whether this loss matters is debatable. We don't need traditional belladonna preparations when we have safer synthetic medications. But something is lost when we sever these connections to plant knowledge that sustained our ancestors for thousands of years. In popular culture, belladonna maintains a dark fascination. It appears in novels, films, television shows, and video games as a convenient plot device for poisoning scenes. These fictional portrayals often get the details wrong, showing effects that are more dramatic or more rapid than reality, but they keep belladonna in public consciousness in a way that few other plants achieve. The association with witchcraft and magic gives belladonna a mystique that extends beyond its actual properties. Modern witchcraft communities, particularly those interested in historical practices, maintain complicated relationships with the plant. Some argue for the importance of understanding these traditional tools, even if not using them. Others point out that nearly everything traditionally done with belladonna can be accomplished more safely with other plants or modern alternatives. This cultural presence ensures that belladonna poisonings continue to occur, often among young people who encounter the plant in fiction and become curious about it in reality. Every few years, news stories emerge about teenagers who found belladonna growing wild and decided to experiment with it, usually with tragic results. These incidents prompt calls for better education about toxic plants, but the cycle continues. Modern poison control centers handle belladonna cases differently than they did decades ago. With better understanding of the alkaloid's mechanisms and improved supportive care techniques, survival rates for serious poisoning have improved significantly. But treatment remains challenging and resource-intensive, often requiring days in intensive care with careful management of temperature, cardiac rhythm, and seizures. Some survivors report lasting effects months or years after poisoning. Persistent vision problems, cardiac arrhythmias that require ongoing treatment, memory issues, and psychological trauma from the delirium and its aftermath. Even when poisoning doesn't kill, it can permanently alter lives. This is part of belladonna's legacy, not just the deaths documented in history books, but the damaged lives that history often overlooks. Legal systems around the world have developed various approaches to regulating belladonna. Some countries classify it as a controlled substance, making unauthorized possession or cultivation illegal. Others regulate only concentrated preparations or extracted alkaloids, leaving the plant itself uncontrolled since it grows wild and has some legitimate uses. The rise of the internet has complicated regulation enormously. Information about identifying, harvesting, preparing, and using belladonna is readily available online. Seeds can be purchased from botanical suppliers with no questions asked. As we move deeper into the 21st century, belladonna's story continues to evolve. Climate change may affect where and how vigorously the plant grows. Urbanization is destroying some wild belladonna populations while inadvertently creating new habitats in abandoned industrial sites and waste ground where the plant thrives. The pharmaceutical industry continues to find uses for atropine extracted from belladonna or synthesized in laboratories. Beyond its use as an antidote to nerve agents and certain poisonings, atropine is used in emergency cardiac care, in ophthalmology for eye examinations, and in anesthesia. The global market for atropine and related compounds runs into hundreds of millions of dollars annually, representing one of the few contexts where belladonna's properties generate economic benefit without causing harm. Looking at belladonna's complete history from ancient Sumerian texts to modern research laboratories, certain themes emerge repeatedly. Knowledge is power, and knowledge of poisons is a particularly potent form of power. Those who understood belladonna held life and death in their hands, whether they were physicians healing the sick, assassins eliminating enemies, or criminals exploiting victims. The thin line between medicine and poison, between healing and harming, runs through belladonna's entire story. The same plant, sometimes the same preparation, could ease suffering or cause agony depending on dose and intent. This duality challenges simple moral frameworks and reminds us that nature is amoral. Plants don't choose to be medicinal or toxic. They simply produce compounds that affect biological systems in various ways. We project meaning and morality onto these neutral facts. The plant has been a mirror, reflecting human nature in all its complexity. The Renaissance woman enduring burning eye drops for beauty shows us vanity and the social pressures that enforce beauty standards. The desperate poisoner eliminating an abusive spouse shows us the terrible calculations people make when they feel trapped. The shaman using belladonna to commune with the spirit world shows us the human hunger for transcendence and meaning. The physician carefully dosing belladonna to ease a patient's suffering shows us the desire to heal and the courage to work with dangerous tools for beneficial ends. As you've journeyed through this history, from ancient Rome to modern research labs, from Renaissance poison gardens to Colombian crime scenes, you've seen belladonna in countless contexts, causing immeasurable harm but also occasionally providing benefit. You've encountered emperors and peasants, poisoners and physicians, victims and survivors, all connected through their relationships with this single plant. The question that might linger as this story ends is whether belladonna is ultimately humanity's enemy or ally. The answer, perhaps unsatisfyingly, is both and neither. Belladonna is simply a plant following its evolutionary programming, producing alkaloids for its own purposes that happen to have profound effects on human nervous systems. We've made it into weapon and medicine, cosmetic and sacrament, depending on our needs and intentions. The evil and good associated with belladonna come from human choices, not from the plant itself. In the quiet hours of early morning, in that liminal space between sleeping and waking, you might reflect on what this long, dark history teaches us. That knowledge can heal or harm depending on how it's used. That beauty often comes with costs we don't anticipate. That the line between medicine and poison is measured in milligrams and intentions. That every generation thinks it knows better than the last, yet makes similar mistakes with deadly substances. That nature's poisons demand respect that human arrogance often fails to provide. Somewhere, as you drift towards sleep, belladonna continues growing. In European forests, in cultivated gardens, in wild corners of abandoned parks. The plant doesn't know about the thousands it has killed, the empires it has shaped, the medical discoveries it has enabled. It simply grows, photosynthesizes, produces flowers and berries and alkaloids, following patterns established millions of years before humans walked the earth. And perhaps that's the most unsettling lesson of all. This plant that has played such a dramatic role in human history has no awareness of any of it. The beautiful lady is beautiful only because we see her that way. Deadly only because our physiology happens to be vulnerable to her chemical defenses. The entire complex, bloody, fascinating history of belladonna and humanity is a story we tell ourselves about a plant that would exist exactly the same, whether we were here to notice it or not. The kingdoms belladonna has poisoned have fallen into dust. The Roman Empire, the Italian city-states, the Victorian British Empire, all collapsed into history. The emperors and assassins, the poisoners and physicians, the beautiful women with dilated pupils, and the victims writhing in delirium, all have long since returned to the earth that also nourishes belladonna's roots. In the end, belladonna's story is our story. A tale of ambition and vanity, desperation and cruelty, brilliance and folly, suffering and healing. The plant has been our accomplice in countless dramas across thousands of years, the silent third character in murders and miracles, always present, never judging, simply being what evolution made it. As the final darkness of sleep approaches, perhaps you'll dream of those shiny black berries glistening in the forest shadows, of dilated pupils, reflecting candlelight in Renaissance ballrooms, of physicians working by lamplight, to extract just enough poison to heal without killing. Of all the untold stories of belladonna's victims whose names are lost but whose sufferings were just as real as those we remember. The beautiful lady keeps her secrets well. For every story we know, countless others have vanished into time. For every recorded poisoning, how many went undetected, attributed to natural illness? For every documented murder, how many succeeded so perfectly that no one ever suspected? Sleep comes at last, deep and dreamless, carrying you far from belladonna's deadly embrace. But the plant remains, out there in the darkness, growing silently, patiently, waiting for the next person who thinks they can control it. Waiting as it has waited for thousands of years, beautiful and deadly, medicine and poison, the plant that poisoned kingdoms and will outlast them all. The night ends, the story continues. Somewhere, someone is discovering belladonna for the first time, drawn to those shiny berries, not knowing the weight of history they're about to encounter. The cycle begins again, as it always has, as it perhaps always will. Until then, the beautiful lady dances on, deadly and indifferent, seductive and merciless, inscribed not in books but in the DNA of countless victims, in the eternal fact that some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to pay, yet we pay it anyway, again and again, generation after generation. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them, knowing what you now know about the beautiful lady who poisoned kingdoms. The plant doesn't sleep, doesn't dream, doesn't remember or forget. It simply exists, following programming written in its genes millions of years ago. Sleep now, rest now, let the long dark history fade into dreams. But remember, when you wake, that belladonna is still out there, still growing, still waiting, still dangerous. The beautiful lady who poisoned kingdoms might yet have more chapters to add to her long dark history. She has outlasted empires and will outlast us. Plants patient enough can outlive civilizations, and belladonna is nothing if not patient.